Hearings of the governor's budget proposals. Today, of course, we're taking up budget reserves, everybody's favorite subject. I say that only because I don't know that there's a year that's gone by, the 11 that I've been here, where we've not had some debate over budget reserves. Of course, we have our general reserve, which is the special fund for economic uncertainties. That is, in recent years, represented by about $1 billion annually. Then, of course, we also have the voter-approved in 2004 Prop 58, otherwise known as the Budget Stabilization Account. And that, of course, requires that 3% of general fund revenue up to $8 billion or 5% of general fund, whichever is greater, be put into the Budget Stabilization Account. And the budget that is before us for the 2014-2015 year does, in fact, put that 3% of general fund deposit into the account, and as per dictate of the voter-approved Prop 58, half of that, $1.6 billion, used to pay down finally the remainder of the Schwarzenegger economic recovery bonds. So we will hear from the Department of Finance. We will hear from our Legislative Analyst Office. We'll also have presentations reflecting some best practices, looking at what other states are doing and where we've seen more positive results. Of course, the goal here always to reduce the revenue volatility that we've experienced and which has had such an impact on California taxpayers in recent years. I think that we could all probably agree that some good themes in pursuing a successful budget reserve would include something that's understandable, something that we can explain to our constituents, something that's flexible. Too rigid, of course, as the LAO reminds us oftentimes, is not going to serve the purpose that it's intended. And then, of course, to reduce any revenue volatility. So with that, I know that our committee vice chair, Senator Nielsen, would like to make an opening comment, and then we'll get to the Department of Finance and to the Legislative Analyst's Office. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing an informational hearing on this very, very important issue. I might rhetorically ask, why are we here, though? Because in 2010, a bipartisan negotiated budget included this kind of a spending cap. Well, we don't know what this kind is, but it included a spending cap, and that's still hovering a space out there somewhere. I would argue that the provisions in that are where we at least should start, if not where we should finish. But let's not forget that this has already been, in a bipartisan way, negotiated. It is something that must happen. But the key is, what is it? We're maybe just talking about concepts here. That's very fluid. Until we get actual language, most of the things are just kind of general conversation. I'm looking forward to the language as to what the governor will actually propose. And then where will be the beef? What are the teeth in this? For example, I would argue that, as in the looming constitutional amendment out there, the higher priority for use of that reserve would be debt retirement. If you argue it's for one-time spending, that might be a little bit of a governor on something, governor to control it, hold it back, but not necessarily. Because if you have a one-time expenditure, you create a constituency who likes that and are going to fight very hard to keep it. So we will have a good conversation here, maybe set the grounds for continued discussion, but nothing really begins until we see the actual language. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And with that, if we could please welcome the Department of Finance. Welcome back, Ms. Bosler. You're welcome to have your budget managers with you, or go it alone as you like.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Keely Bosler with the Department of Finance, and it's my pleasure to be here today to provide some additional details and to discuss in more detail the governor's budget proposal related to strengthening our current rainy day fund. I was going to start out with exactly what the chair outlined in his opening statement, so I do have a short presentation, but
that wasn't coordinated.
Yes, we are doing something in 14-15 budget to really put away monies to avoid the boom and bust cycles that have really plagued the state over the past decade by making the first deposit into the Proposition 58 budget stabilization account since 2007. Proposition 58 does require a 3% annual transfer to the BSA, but this transfer has been suspended every year since 2007 because of the state's fiscal situation. And by operation of that law, 50% is being used to pay down the economic recovery bonds, and actually with this payment we'll finally pay off those bonds, which were issued to pay off budgetary debts from as far back as 2002-03. So that's a very big accomplishment in this budget. And then the other half is on deposit in the budget stabilization account, and that's about $1.6 billion. And together with the special fund for economic uncertainties that the chair also mentioned in his opening statement, there's about $2.3 billion in reserve in the governor's January 10 budget. So why look at revising the state's rainy day fund? I think much has been written and much has been discussed about the state's progressive tax structure and the effect that has on the revenue volatility. And really, in order to avoid the boom and bust that has really plagued the state over the past decade, there are many different approaches that one can take in order to address the volatility, including tax reform. But the governor's budget proposes to better manage this volatility by better managing the revenue spikes that are really at the root cause of the volatility. And certainly voters did take a first step in this direction with Proposition 58. But I think that Proposition 58 has shown some weaknesses in its operation over the past several years. I mean, not because of, since we have actually suspended the transfer for many years. And there really are no restrictions on when deposited funds can be withdrawn. And mainly, I think the requirement that 3% must go in every year, whether it's a lean year or an abundant year, I think that's really led to a situation where, the transfers just haven't been made. And so, while Proposition 58 is a good base, I think we feel like there's weaknesses in the existing structure. Also, ACA 4, which was a constitutional amendment passed by the legislature in 2010, the governor's budget feels that this is an improvement over the existing structure because it does tighten when deposits are made and when withdrawals are allowed. But it has a few key features that I think are shortcomings. First, it does not allow the state to pay down what is a sizable accumulated liabilities that the state has ahead of making deposits into the rainy day fund. And it also does nothing to address the sharp ups and downs of the Proposition 98 guarantee that have been so devastating over the past few years. Also, it bases deposits into the rainy day fund on the past 20 years of revenues, rather than really getting at the heart of the volatility in the state's revenue base, which are the spikes in capital gains. So with that, the governor's budget does propose to build an alternative lasting rainy day fund to replace ACA 4 on the ballot this upcoming November. The proposal would build on the Proposition 58 budget stabilization account and would also create a separate Proposition 98 reserve really to protect education from cuts when we go through another a downturn, economic downturn. Also, the governor's proposal would would go into effect for the 15-16 fiscal year, and this is in contrast to ACA 4, which has impacts in the budget year that we're currently debating. The next few slides, I'm just going to go through a few of the key features of our new proposed rainy day fund.
So everyone knows, we're on page 5 of the handout.
Sorry, yes, page 5. And just to a distinction, there's the Proposition 98 reserve is really a very different reserve. It has different rules for deposit and withdrawal. And everything that I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides is really going to be directed towards the budget stabilization account piece, the more general reserve. The Proposition 98 reserve, which has different rules, I will discuss at the end of the presentation. So the first, I think, key difference of the governor's proposed rainy day fund is that we are going to propose to base the deposits into the reserve on capital gain spikes. So really going up to the direct heart of the volatility in our revenue structure. We would propose capital gains in excess of 6.5% of general fund tax proceeds be set aside. This is, of course, after the Proposition 98, the amount due to Proposition 98 is set aside. And then we would also propose a true-up process for the 2 preceding years. I think, one of the big criticisms about using capital gains revenues is exactly the reason why we're also using them, which is they are very volatile and they're very difficult to forecast. And so the true-up mechanism is really meant to be able to go back and do a look back and make sure that we didn't overcommit resources into the reserve, or also there may be a situation where we commit resources and then we have an opportunity the next year to catch up and ensure that there's money building up into the reserve. Another key feature is that we propose to double the maximum size of the rainy day fund from 5% to 10%. The current budget stabilization account, it has a 5% of general fund tax proceeds ceiling. We would propose to double that to 10%. This is similar to the structure or the size of the reserve in ACA 4. And I really think that increasing the ceiling is really important to better enabling the state to mitigate the next really significant economic downturn, especially in light of what we've just experienced in the state. Moving on. Also, a key feature of our proposal is that once the BSA ceiling is met, the 10% is accumulated in the reserve. There would be an allowance for one-time purposes for revenues above that level, including debt repayments. Also, there would be a provision to allow the state to pay down debt, and this is and avoid debt in lieu of making the budget stabilization account deposit. But this would be a much a smaller universe of expenditures than if we'd already accumulated $10 billion or 10% of the general fund. That would be a larger one-time purposes category. But before we actually put money in reserve, I think we feel like it's very important for the long-term liabilities of our state that we have an option to make supplemental payments on our existing wall of debt, also make payments on unfunded pension liabilities above the base amount that's already scheduled, and then also make other investments to retire unissued debt. And how this would work is as general obligation bonds are approved by voters, inevitably there will be additional general obligation bonds in our future. Instead of actually going out and issuing those bonds, we would allow for upfront pay-as-you-go investments in infrastructure. At the same time, would be retiring that GO bond debt. So it's really an option to provide debt avoidance so we don't continue to accumulate the large debts that we currently have. In terms of a budget emergency and when we might want to suspend or reduce deposits into the budget stabilization account. Similar to the current system, there would be a required budget emergency that would have to be called, but different than the current Prop 58. This would also require a legislative action to suspend the transfer into the budget stabilization account. Also, during a budget emergency, there would be the ability to withdraw funds, but this would also be limited to only 50% of the monies deposited in the budget stabilization account, unless there had been a withdrawal in the preceding year. So really, the thoughts behind this is to really be able to withstand a multi-year downturn in the state's economics and revenues by allowing the use of the reserve over a multi-year period. And then I just want to conclude with giving you a little bit more information about the Proposition 98 reserve, which is really a very different reserve, but equally important to really smoothing out the ups and downs that have been so devastating for school districts over the last few years. And I just want to start by saying that there's nothing in our proposal that would change the Proposition 98 calculation. But we would establish a 98 reserve for Prop 98 funding attributed to capital gains revenues above 6.5% of general fund tax proceeds. We would also allow the same true-up mechanisms, which are actually quite familiar in Proposition 98 world, where we're constantly looking back 2 years and truing up the level of the guarantee and the amount of money owed to schools. So under our proposal, we would also true up the reserve component of the Prop 98 calculation as well. We would also propose a 10% cap on the Prop 98 reserve. And also, after the ceiling was met, those additional monies above the cap would be able to flow back to schools or would flow directly to schools for Proposition 98 purposes. Also, deposits would not necessarily be made automatically into the Prop 98 reserve if the Prop 98 guarantee was not growing at a level sufficient to fund enrollment growth and to provide a cost of living adjustment. So in those years where additional monies are needed for COLA and enrollment growth, the monies would not be deposited into the reserve. Also, in terms of withdrawing monies from the Prop 98 reserve, there's going to be our proposal would have slightly different rules. And specifically, it would allow not just when a governor's budget emergency was called, there could be withdrawals from the reserve, but also when there was a need for additional monies to fully fund enrollment growth and cost of living adjustments as well. And there would not be a 50% limit on the Proposition 98 reserve. So just in summary, the budget makes a down payment on saving for a rainy day, but really to avoid the boom and bust cycle that has really plagued the state over the past decade, the governor's budget proposes a new rainy day fund really to help California deal with its most volatile revenue source, which is really the capital gains portion of our revenues. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very comprehensive introductory comments and overview of the governor's proposal. Colleagues, I thought it might make sense for us to take a few questions now before we move on to the LAO, and then also have the opportunity to ask the LAO some questions. And if there's an opportunity or desire to have an exchange between LAO and Finance, we can do that as well. I'll start off with a couple questions. In your comments, you had expressed some concern with the period of time that's used to determine some of the particulars of ACA 4. So I just wanted to ask how you got to some of the determinations within the governor's proposal for this new budget reserve. Number one, 6.5%. Why don't we start there? Is there something magic
Yeah,
about that
I mean, I think
number?
the 6.5%, if you look back at the past decade, the amount has actually been slightly higher than 6.5%. There isn't a lot of magic behind that number. I think that we have chosen a number that's slightly lower than the average over the past 10 years because I think we think it's really important for the state to be able to ensure that there are some monies that are going to start to build up in that reserve. As we are already 4 years into our current economic expansion, I think that there's concerns that any kind of negative outlook on the economy could send us right back into budget deficits. And so I think, choosing that lower number, lower than the average, was important to start to accumulate some reserve funds.
And I know that we're going to see a slide in one of the later presentations, I think in our third panel, that suggests that there's not that much difference from the trend lines of total revenue with capital gains and without. And so trying to get to why we should be considering just using capital gains as opposed to some other combination of revenue sources for the 6.5%.
Yeah. I mean, capital gains certainly isn't the only source of revenues that is causing volatility in our revenues, but it certainly is the largest, and and it has been historically very volatile. But I think, I don't want to oversell that the budget stabilization account that we propose is going to completely eliminate volatility in our revenue system. I think there will still be volatility, but I think basing it on the capital gains gives us a very, a good chunk. It takes a big chunk out of the volatility. But I mean, I think it would be. I would be amiss to say that it would completely eliminate the volatility. But I think we chose that. I think part of a concern about ACA 4 is it is a very complex measure. This is a simpler measure. It's easier to conceptualize. A lot of times these discussions about reserve policies can be very complicated and very difficult to really understand how the impacts will be felt. And I think, part of the simplicity of just using the capital gains, which is our largest source of volatility today, was also part of the appeal.
And before we get any further into this conversation, will the language, which we don't have yet, actually define capital gains? And are we in charge of how that is defined? Could there be changes at the federal level in tax law that could, in effect, redefine capital gains, and then everything that we've been talking about here could potentially shift and change dramatically?
Yes, we're definitely still. I apologize that we do not have the language before you today. I mean, drafting in the Constitution is something we all take very seriously, and so we're working hard to get that language in as good a shape as possible. I think definition of capital gains is something that we would have, and I might turn it over to Veronica to give a little bit more detail about the definition of capital gains. And actually, I think we have our revenue folks here as well. But
they're here.
I think there's always concern about a shift in or change in the tax base and the tax structure and how that might impact something as lasting as a constitutional amendment in a reserve policy in the constitutional amendment. But I think, our intent is to make it very clear what the capital gains are, but an understanding that there could be, changes in tax law in the future. And I think that's something we go into with eyes wide open, that it's not necessarily perfect. But I'm going to have Jay talk a little bit about the definition of capital gains.
Please.
Good afternoon. The concept that we have for capital gains that we use in designing the reserve policy is capital gains that we typically think of when discussing capital gains. It's capital gains on personal income tax returns, on reported by resident Californians, So it right now it does follow the federal definition of capital gains, and it excludes corporate capital gains or capital gains earned by fiduciaries and other entities.
And can you help us better understand the term carried interest? When I hear of it and think of it, it's the money that those hedge fund managers are making, which gets taxed at 15% at the federal level. What actually is the carried interest, and is that a part of capital gains?
My understanding is that is not part of capital gains. I'm sorry, that it is part of capital, that it is considered capital gains.
For purposes of the governor's proposal?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's under the federal law, it's considered capital gains, and therefore we would depict it.
And what could conceivably happen in Washington that could affect us if there were a change in tax policy that impacted capital gains, whether the rate at which it's taxed or any other changes that could come out of Washington?
Well, currently at the federal level, there are differential rates for capital gains versus other income, and long-term versus short-term.
Right.
We don't have that in our law, and in any, this policy does not address the rates at which these. It does address the rates, the California rates, but it doesn't address any federal rates. So the feds change the rate structure on capital gains. That would not have any impact on this policy.
What could the federal government do that could impact us?
If they change the definition of capital gains for example, the carried interest that you discussed, that could have an impact on capital gains.
So if carried interest were, but that definition would in effect be driven by a change in tax rate?
Yes, if the feds, for purposes of wanting to tax it at a higher rate, wanted to...
Like other kinds of income?
Yes, wanted to define that as same as wages or interest income, business income, and they wanted to tax it at a different rate, they could define capital gains to exclude that type of income. And therefore, if we are still holding to the federal position, we could have we would then have a change in the way capital gains are defined.
So all of this conjecture and unknown and uncertain, but we could be at risk of the federal government determining how we manage our own budget reserve by changes that could be made.
Yes, and I mean, I think that is a risk regardless of the tact that we take. If there's a large change at the federal level with the tax structure, clearly us basing capital gains, making capital gains the trigger for what gets deposited in the reserve, that is a risk, definitely. But I mean, I think that, over the past decades, I mean, we have not been shy about going back and revising the Constitution if such a major change is really impacting us in either direction, overly constraining or not effective at all. So I think that's something that, is a risk that's out there. That's all I'll say.
And has there been any modeling done, let's say over a 10-year or 15 or 20-year period, to see what the alternative results would have been if ACA 4 had been in place, or if the governor's proposal had been in place, or if Prop 58 had been in place, so that we could just see how these things might actually have played out?
Modeling of these things is complicated because there are many policy decisions that would have to be embedded, especially around Proposition 98. We have done a simplistic analysis over the past 10 years of what would have been put into the reserve, and then also how the true-up mechanism would work based on our actual capital gains that we've received over the 10-year period. And so we're starting to, I think it has limited use because, frankly, it doesn't show, what policy decisions would have been made. It also doesn't, or were made, because it's
But you could use some constants so that we could compare apples to apples, even if there could also be oranges to oranges.
So we have looked back, but we haven't done anything going forward at this stage.
Okay. And one last question. I know colleagues have questions as well. You've been very forthright about the true-up and recognizing that we don't always know what the total numbers are going to be until a few years out, which then may impact what we've already done. Is it possible that we could find ourselves in a situation after a true-up where we actually were making cuts to programs at the same time we were going to be putting money into a reserve, which seems rather counterintuitive, but I could imagine that could happen?
It seems unlikely, but it could be that there, on the margin, that there might be a situation where, we're in the first year of a decline and truing up the 2 years prior, we would have wanted to have put money aside and we didn't put enough aside. So there's certainly situations where it's possible that could occur. I think that's why, we're going to try and get these revenue estimates as good as possible on the front end, and also why we've chosen that slightly lower 6.5% number, so that we don't have that situation. But I think that without having actually modeled it, I can't say definitively that would not be the case.
And one last question pops into my head. I know again that we're going to hear from a second panel on the issue of what other states are doing. In putting this together, have you and your staff done comparisons of other states and to look for best practices to see where a budget reserve is actually getting to the goals that we're here discussing?
We did, and actually, Veronica put together a very lengthy chart on that, because we did look around the country. It's sometimes difficult to compare California. Frankly, we have a lot of different mechanisms in our state. We have a Proposition 98 guarantee that's unlike others in other states. And so, I think we tried to take the best that we different components from different states and put together our proposal that we have before you today. But we did look around the country to see what some of the well-managed states were doing.
Good to hear. Senator Berryhill.
Oh, thank you, and sorry I was late. Just a couple quick questions, and I know that this is a whole new proposal that you're trying to come up with. I know it's complicated. We did it in 2010. I thought we had a deal. Evidently, we're changing it. But is there any way, and I know we keep harping on this, but we do think a rainy day fund is really important. And forgive us if we're a little bit skeptical up here about seeing stuff at the last minute and seeing language at the last. I mean, it's happened time and time and time again. Can you throw a dart and when you think that you're actually maybe going to have language that we can sit down and talk about?
I hope very soon, but I can't speculate today. But we are working on it. I think drafting the Constitution is important work, and we don't want to have unintended consequences of what we're doing. So spending a little bit more time right now.
But can we assume in the next couple months?
That would definitely be my assumption, yes.
Yeah. Definitely before the end of the year.
I think we understand that it needs to be out there for consideration before it can actually be approved. So yes, definitely.
The other question I have is, and it was interesting because we were looking at this, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a fairly liberal organization, has mentioned, maybe you mentioned this in your opening remarks. If you did, I apologize, but they mentioned that they thought bigger rainy day funds were better, and they mentioned 15%. And we're going to ask the LAO also what their thoughts are on this. But what do you think is a healthy number?
It's a very good question. Our proposal has a 10% reserve, which is the same level that was proposed in ACA 4, and is really a doubling of the 5%. But I mean, the right answer is really a very complicated analysis, and I think we think 10% is a good amount to deal with the volatility that we see in the state's revenues today. So that was the call that we made on the 10% level.
To the chairman's question, I just want to kind of segue. He's worried about us cutting while we're putting money in that rainy day fund. Won't in your language there'll be language stipulating that we've got some flexibility there, I would think?
Yes, so a budget emergency is what would need to be called
So it wouldn't be
in order to
mandated.
take monies out of the reserve or to suspend deposits into the reserve. So, in the event that there is a budget emergency, that there wouldn't be a need to be putting money into the reserve if there really is truly a budget emergency. So,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to take just a moment, establish our quorum. If you could call the roll, please.
Leno,
Here.
Nielsen, Anderson, Bell, Berryhill,
Here.
Block, Corbett, Hancock, Jackson, Liu, Mitchell, Monning, Roth,
Here.
Torres, Walters, Wyland. We have a quorum.
Thank you, colleagues. We have questions from Senator Roth and Senator Nielsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ma'am, first of all, I applaud reserves. I like them. The more, the better. I have some concerns about the proposed Prop 98 reserve. We spent a lot of time last year dealing with the governor's local control funding formula and the local control accountability planning process, which I certainly support and supported. And we've spent a lot of time working with our districts to implement those concepts, pushing local control down to the districts, the parents, the students, and the stakeholders. Isn't this Prop 98 reserve fund somewhat inconsistent with the local control funding formula concept, and why don't we let the districts maintain these reserves? Would be my question.
I think that the Prop 98 reserve proposal is really coming out of what we just experienced, where the districts were subject to extreme swings in the guarantee, where they were still in an expansion mode one year, and the next year they were faced with such difficult times that they couldn't even rely on their own local reserves to get them through. They had to go through layoff processes to write their budgets. And so I think the concept, is really to help smooth that for school districts around the state by just holding back a small portion that is attributed to what are going to be, in our minds, they're one-time spikes in capital gains revenues. So that they aren't sent down to the districts to be immediately taken away the next year. I mean, I think I understand absolutely what you're getting to in terms of subsidiarity and, shouldn't the locals have the opportunity to do this themselves? And, I think the answer is yes, they should be doing it. And I think our reserve at the state level is just an additional backstop because the swings in the 98 guarantee can be so large, up and down.
And just one follow-up question then. With respect to the governor's proposal, are there any restrictions in that proposal on the state's ability to either borrow against or borrow from the 98 reserve for non-98 purposes in future years?
So both the BSA and the 98 reserve, they all would be in the state treasury. And as some of you will recall over the last few years, we have to do a lot of we have to do a lot of borrowing just for cash flow purposes every year. Less so in the recent years because we have had more cash on hand. So those reserves, while they are reserves, they cannot be used for anything for long-term budgetary purposes. They are tapped into on a daily basis for cash borrowables. But that does not mean that 98 money could be used for anything non-98 at the end of the day. It would just be on a daily cash basis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.